The Vietnam War stood out as a particularly bloody conflict in U.S. history, during which over 500,000 men were enlisted in the military. Many of them had little understanding of the purpose of the invasion. In addition to voluntary enlistment, there was a draft system where eligible men of certain ages were randomly selected for compulsory military service through a lottery. This led to considerable low morale among the troops and a worrying increase in fragging incidents against superiors, especially in the Army and Marine Corps. The term refers to soldiers deliberately killing their superiors by throwing explosives, often to simulate accidents or combat casualties and cover up their actions. There were critical moments in the war when, paradoxically, commanders feared more that their own men would throw a grenade into their tents than facing the deadly surprise ambushes of the Viet Cong. Join us in this new installment of military history to explore the details of this dark episode that instilled fear in the jungles of Vietnam and undermined trust within the U.S. Navy. Let's begin. During the Vietnam War, which spanned from 1955 to 1975, all parties involved were immersed in 2 decades of unprecedented turmoil, raising deep doubts about the viability of U.S. intervention. The Domino Theory, which argued that the spread of communism would expand across Southeast Asia if any democratic nation fell, was used to justify U.S. involvement in the conflict. Amid this tumultuous context, a disturbing phenomenon known as fragging emerged, altering the power dynamics between officers and soldiers. Although fragging was not entirely new, it surged during the Vietnam War, with numerous documented cases, such as that of Reginald F. Smith and Lieutenant Robert T. Roweller. The incident involving Lieutenant Roweller stands out as one of the most tragic cases of fragging during the Vietnam War. On April 21, 1969, a grenade was thrown into the office of Company K 9th Marines at the Quang Tri-Combat Base, South Vietnam. Lieutenant Roweller was severely injured in the explosion and subsequently died from his injuries. Soldier Reginald F. Smith confessed to the premeditated murder of his lieutenant and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Smith remained in custody until his death on June 25, 1982. The weapon used by the soldier to kill Roweller was the most common for these treacherous murders, an M33 fragmentation grenade. When the murderer boasted about killing his superior, he still had the grenade ring on his finger.
This is the M33 hand grenade. Being approximately spherical in shape, it distributes its high-velocity fragments evenly over the target area.
Insubordination in the U.S. Armed Forces manifested in lethal attacks against superiors, driven by motivations that included a loss of respect for officers, racial tensions, and the influence of countercultural rebellion. According to a company commander, many soldiers feared being under the command of leaders whose reckless and erratic tactics, akin to those of John Wayne, endangered their lives, exacerbating distrust toward leadership. Additionally, the influence of anti-war sentiment at home contributed to an atmosphere of alienation and resentment that often triggered acts of insubordination. The Vietnam War created a division in American public opinion. From October 1963, when the U.S. had only sent military advisors to Vietnam, significant student protests began emerging across the country. These demonstrations expressed widespread disagreement with the conflict, uniting students in their belief of its injustice. Over time, protests grew as the assault intensified, with some turning violent. Protest forms ranged from large peaceful demonstrations, such as the march of over 500,000 people in Washington, D.C. on April 24, 1971, to street riots. Meanwhile, soldiers faced the threat of the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force operating in southern Vietnam. Emerging as an extension of the National Front for the Liberation of Vietnam in 1960, this group employed highly effective tactics, such as placing explosive traps in the dense jungle and staging ambushes against enemy troops. It is important to highlight that a significant portion of U.S. soldiers deployed to Vietnam did not enlist voluntarily, but were drafted through the ongoing military conscription. Of the 27 million eligible men, the US drafted 2.2 million during the conflict. This number included many men who chose to enlist voluntarily to avoid compulsory service. This situation led to various strategies to evade service, such as intentionally failing aptitude tests or fleeing to Canada. As a result, a sense of resentment developed both among the soldiers and towards their superiors. Fragging was a way for soldiers to discourage commanders from being too enthusiastic about combat. As the Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular, soldiers' morale declined. They saw no reason to risk their lives for a losing war that most did not support. Many soldiers were assigned a one-year tour of duty, which meant there was less cohesion within units. For some servicemen, fragging was a matter of personal survival, eliminating superiors to ensure their own survival in the Vietnam War. As American soldiers faced the Viet Cong in a conflict where the US made little progress, this practice was sometimes used to remove leaders perceived as incompetent or a threat to the group's survival. Soldiers sensed that unit leaders would jeopardize their subordinates' lives for personal interests. This phenomenon had unexpected effects, such as the rise of opioid addiction among American soldiers. In certain units, servicemen used fragging to challenge anti-drug policies. Consequently, officers tolerated drug use and general insubordination for fear of becoming victims themselves.
I don't care.
Shotgun.
The absence of restrictions on narcotics made drugs readily available to already traumatized soldiers. Occasionally, unit leaders who enforced discipline or rules received warnings from their own subordinates. Faced with the threat of fragging, these leaders often backed down when they found a fragmentation grenade with their name written on it, or saw signs of tampering with weapons in their belongings. Despite the few cases resolved and the limited convictions, lower-ranking soldiers often banded together to protect their peers, making it difficult to identify the culprits in incidents. Those who were convicted received notably lenient sentences, with some serving as little as 10 months in prison. A significant episode occurred in 1969 when Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt orchestrated and led the assault on Hamburger Hill, a small mountain in South Vietnam where a fierce battle raged for 10 days. US troops engaged in a brutal struggle for control of the 3,000-foot hill. Despite capturing it, the hill was abandoned shortly afterward, allowing North Vietnamese forces to reclaim it. This event was viewed by many as a senseless loss of life, fueling ongoing debate and resentment among American soldiers. After the assault, an underground armed forces newspaper offered a $10,000 bounty for Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt's life, resulting in several failed assassination attempts against him. By then, the soldiers' discontent with some of their superiors was already evident. Captain Scott Edward Schneider, 25, who led an artillery battery of the U.S. Army in Quang Ngai Province, Vietnam, in 1970, was regarded by his subordinates as a competent and fair leader in his discipline. However, at 1:40 a.m. on August 17th of that year, while he was sleeping, a fellow American threw a fragmentation grenade into his quarters, causing his instant death. The Army accused one of Schneider's soldiers, David K. Laughlin, of the murder. Enlistees who had worked with Laughlin described him as a drug addict. The 19-year-old perpetrator had been a regular user of hashish, LSD, and amphetamines before arriving in Vietnam. Since then, his drug use had expanded to include the daily intake of a 6-ounce bottle of the amphetamine liquid obesitol. Fragging statistics primarily cover incidents involving explosives, typically grenades, but there were also several hundred murders with firearms. In those cases, it was usually men of equal rank shooting each other. There were rumors that enlisted soldiers deliberately killed officers and non-commissioned officers by exploiting the chaos of the battlefield to go unpunished. Another incident in Nui Dat involved soldier Paul Raymond Faraday, indiscriminately and randomly shooting at a meeting of sergeants from the Royal Australian Army Service Corps with his SLR rifle. Faraday, who committed the crime while heavily intoxicated, was described as paranoid and prone to outbursts of rage by a military psychiatrist during his court-martial. Witnesses testified that the shooter was aware of his own actions and provided details of previous altercations. The soldier was convicted of 2 counts of manslaughter. In response to the increasing number of fragging incidents, the U.S. Army began to impose stricter restrictions on the availability of weapons. In May 1971, the Army had to temporarily halt the issuance of grenades to all units in Vietnam and confiscated weapons, ammunition, explosives, and knives. Despite these efforts, this did not reduce the number of incidents. If soldiers could not obtain weapons from the U.S. Army, they acquired them through the black market. In Vietnam, the possibility of being killed by their own subordinates led many officers and non-commissioned officers to carry weapons in rear areas and alter their sleeping arrangements, as fragging often involved throwing a grenade into a tent where the target was sleeping. Fearing being the victim of this practice, some leaders turned a blind eye to drug use and other indiscipline among their men. The threat of fragging and investigations into these practices sometimes interrupted or delayed tactical combat operations. At times, officers were forced to negotiate with their soldiers to gain their consent before undertaking dangerous patrols. Fragging played a crucial role in prompting the United States to change its enlistment legislation. The last draftee was inducted in 1973. The Volunteer Army moderated some of the coercive disciplinary methods previously used to maintain order within the military ranks. Statistically, the figures are not very clear. Throughout the Vietnam War, there were 800 documented attempts of fragging in the Army and Marine Corps. According to another account, more than 1,000 incidents of this type are believed to have occurred. Between 1969 and 1970 alone, the U.S. Navy reported 305 cases. However, the true number may never be known. This is partly because the attacks themselves make it difficult to determine which were deliberate and why. In an effort to spare the families of victims further pain, the Army did not officially disclose the true cause of death for some of the officers. Richard Nixon, U.S. President during the war, signed an executive order to end conscription on September 28, 1971, but it would not take effect until 1973. When he ran for president in 1968, he had promised to end the draft, a decision he believed would end the protests. Nixon thought that middle-class Americans would lose interest in the war if they were no longer afraid that they or their loved ones would be sent to fight. Thus, the president announced the end of the bloodiest conflict in American military history.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
The United States officially ended its involvement in Vietnam in 1973, along with its military draft. The end of the war also marked the end of the fragging epidemic, something that some historians speculate may not be directly related to the end of conscription. Many professional military personnel believe that an entirely volunteer army tends to have higher morale, support, and discipline. This, combined with stricter selection processes to filter out drug addicts and greater attention to the psychological stress of soldiers, has miraculously reduced the number of incidents. For all the stories of soldiers attacking officers whom they feared would get them killed, a more likely explanation is that fragging was the work of rear echelon misfits with anger and substance control problems, who resented being disciplined and sought revenge. The prevalence of drugs did not help. A study of soldiers returning from Vietnam found that 1 in 5 were addicted to narcotics. The difficulty in distinguishing between fragging and enemy actions, along with soldiers' reluctance to cooperate in investigations, reflects the depth of this problem. Additionally, the variability in sentences and the apparent impunity of some perpetrators raise questions about the effectiveness of the military justice system in adequately addressing these situations. Meanwhile, the death toll remains shrouded in deep mystery due to the confusing circumstances surrounding these incidents. That's it for this video. If this report on the war has intrigued you, we encourage you to subscribe for similar content in future editions of Military History.